Without further ado, let's kick off the 4th Annual Judicial Summit on Mental Health by introducing our first presenter, Dr. Octavio Martinez, Jr. A little bit about Dr. Martinez. He is a JCMH commissioner and is the 5th executive director of the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health. Dr. Martinez is also a clinical professor for the UT Steve Hicks School of Social Work, hook 'em horns, even though we're a little bit disappointed with them from this past weekend. He's also a professor of psychiatry at Dell Medical School, a faculty affiliate with the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice in the School of Law, and an adjunct professor of psychiatry at UT Health San Antonio Long School of Medicine. Recently, in recognition of his leadership in the field of health equity, Dr. Martinez was appointed to the Federal COVID-19 Equity Task Force. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome Dr. Martinez.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. I think our justices have really done a fabulous job of kicking things off and already highlighting some of the wonderful work that's happening in the state of Texas. Let's see if this clicker works. Yay, it does. You know, technology is fabulous when it works, right? But when it doesn't, holy smokes. Can it be the bane of one's existence? Well, one of the things is I threw up a couple of pictures there. So the serious side is the top picture is that's when I was actually way back in when we were actually considering making the Judicial Commission on Mental Health and presenting to the Supreme Court on the rationale and why we needed to do this. So that was fabulous. And of course, a little levity there, and because it is October, so even at the Hogg Foundation, we like to have a little fun. First, so my task was to talk about the future of mental health. It's a formidable task if you think about it. On the other hand, as challenging as it is, it was also a joy to go through and really recognize and see what are the wonderful things that are happening in the great state of Texas. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and then a little bit about how to ongoing implementation of that. So to kick off, I really want to thank the Planning Committee. I want to thank Christy Taylor and her team. All of the justices. It's just amazing what's happening. I want to thank also the folks that are online digitally. Hopefully your technology is working. You're able to see and hear us appropriately. And so let's get going. So the future of mental health in the state of Texas. So what I'd like to start with, in fact, is actually the vision. Where are we going? What is it that we're all working on in different parts of it? And when it all comes together, that holistic view. And here what I have is a culturally linguistically centered healthcare system. For many of us, we have known historically that in fact it's been fragmented, and some of us have even questioned, is it a system? But we are working toward that. And I think over the next few minutes when I share with you some of the things that are happening that many of you are already aware of, but when you put them all together, I think it's actually going to create what we've all been looking for, a continuum of care. But it's going to be one that respects the whole person, really, across their entire lifespan. We recognize that even during conception, how important it is what the mother is exposed to, as well as what's happening at the other end of our lifespan when it's time when the Lord is going to call us back. What's happening when we're older and aged, and how should we actually age with dignity in place, right? Includes the prevention and early intervention. So I mentioned that at one end of the spectrum. Strength-based, looking at each other not as deficits, not what our gaps are, though we recognize them, but also knowing that each of us has much to contribute, including our communities. Trauma-informed, recognizing that as human beings, we are actually emotional beings, and we are subject to trauma. Some of us are more resilient than others. Depends on context, it depends on resources, but it does impact us one way or another. None of us are immune. And so with that comes also the philosophy of we can overcome, we can recover. In many cases, when it comes to mental illness and substance use, we cannot cure yet. One day maybe, but not yet. But what we can do is we can learn to live with. We can learn to overcome, we can learn to recover, move on, and be productive individuals, have loving relationships, and take care of those around us. And of course, also to get to that is achieve health equity. What is health equity about? And I'll touch upon it a little bit later as well. But really it's about quality of care for all. That's what when you hear the word health equity, you should be thinking quality. What do we do to ensure that everyone, in fact, is having a person, family, and community-centered experience when it comes to their health care, and the systems that interact with our health. And so I'm using the Wellbeing Trust. Maybe you may have heard of this new national foundation. By the way, the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health, we started in 1940. We were the first foundation in Texas and in the nation. I'm just bragging a little bit here, guys. That was 100% dedicated to mental health. So we've been around this and been doing this for a while. It's an honor to be the 5th executive director. I came in August of 2008. You guys called me back from North Carolina, come back from Texas. I'm a native Austinite. And it's been such a pleasure to be here now working on behalf of the state of Texas. But this framework, I'm going to use it to sort of highlight some of the things that are happening. And as you can see here, it's pretty comprehensive, everything from the vital community conditions all the way to outcomes. And so let's start with some of those vital community conditions. So one of the ones that we have really been, I think, starting to understand, there's still much that we need to learn about the social determinants of mental health, the social determinants of health, which is the bigger rubric, right? Because mental health there is no health without mental health. And so to all together is understanding what are all those different systems, those different determinants out there that do impact each and every one of us at an individual level, at a family level, community level, state and national, and with this pandemic, international. And so we're doing much better at understanding that and bringing those together and contemplating those different determinants as we go through some of the system changes we're trying to make. Another one to keep in mind is community. I really think that community is a core value. It is a core part of health. It only makes sense when you think about who we are, what we do, where we live, where we pray, where we educate ourselves. It's all about community. And each community is different from one another. We need to be respectful of that. We also need to understand the history of our communities. Some are different than others. They've had different experiences. And so like individuals can have trauma, well, actually so can communities and regions of our country, regions of our state. And so recognizing and acknowledging the cumulative impact of stressful experiences and environments is key to understanding where we've been, where we are, where do we need to go. And I'm not going to read all through these, but they're all wonderful principles of community engagement. I do want to point out, though, that once again, let's be strength-based. Let's understand what communities bring to the table. Too often, historically, even in philanthropy in the foundation world, we have looked at communities like, what's wrong with you? What are you missing? What's going awry? Instead of actually coming in and going, let's partner with you. Let's find out where your strengths are. Where do you need our help? Where do we need your help? And together, then we can move forward. And so building on those strengths and assets are extremely, extremely important. And so there's key components to community engagement. The great thing is there's a great body of knowledge out there on how to do true community engagement. By the way, I'll preface that all I'm saying and talking about, this is hard work. This is not easy. And for those of you that are out there doing it, you know that very much. You recognize how difficult it is to change cultures and environment at all different kind of levels. And yet, why do we do it? Because it is worthwhile, because it is actually what we need to do to overcome and to endure what it is to be a human being. And so we want to prioritize concerns, increase resilience with our communities, instill hope, and move things forward, constantly. And that last bullet, building the strength and assets, incorporate community defined evidence. One of the things that I'm working with at Grant with the Dell Medical School is taking a look at how community actually can be part of the research environment itself. Once again, look at it from a strength-based approach. There's just so many ways that actually we still haven't engaged with community that is still available to us and that we will and do as we move forward. This commission, this is part of the future. Coming together historically, the Supreme Court of Texas, the Criminal Court of Appeals, recognizing patterns and outcomes they didn't like and realizing we've got to change this. This is unacceptable in the state of Texas. This is unacceptable to our communities. We recognize the disproportionality where certain community folks are being hurt more than others. Why is that the case? So you're a part of history. This is amazing. I'm in awe and honored to be a commissioner and to be part of this process, because this is an exemplar for the rest of the country of how we can work together to overcome. What else is happening in the state of Texas? You know, we're doing some once-in-a-lifetime generational stuff, guys. So we recognized back in 2014, a report came out from the state that our state hospitals were pretty much in disarray. Half of them were practically unusable. Can you believe where we landed? But that was the past. We recognized we needed to make an investment in our hospital system, and that's what we're doing. Legislature has set aside funds. ARPA right now is being discussed of how to continue that. It is an amazing process that has kicked off. Tell me any other state out there that's making this kind of investment in their infrastructure for the future to turn it into the 21st century. Because it's not just about beds and buildings. It's not about brick and mortar anymore. We recognize the bigger picture. It's about continuum of care. And that includes, and it's been mentioned by our justices, such as, restoration. Where should it happen? A lot of it can happen out in the community-based, right, restoration. Some needs to happen in other institutional settings for good reason. But to have that whole spectrum, now that is impressive. Well, this was serendipitous. We didn't know the pandemic was coming when we were starting to talk about and thinking about creating the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium. But boy, could you have thought of a better time to kick off. Now, this has been really challenging. I'm also on the executive committee for this consortium. But to stand it up during the pandemic, what a great test. Is this a model or not that actually can make a difference? And it is proving it really is. And take a look. 86 legislature, again, decided to make an investment in mental health. Who for? Going upstream for our children, our youth, and our families. Across the entire state of Texas, we know we don't have the workforce. We have deficits. Primary care is overrun. School districts are asking, we need help, our mental health for our children, the environment. We need to address it. How do we do it? Think out of the box and think logically. If there are other models out there, and we did, the Massachusetts Child Access Program is one of the oldest around and showed that it is efficacious and in fact can make a difference for communities, and create the Texas model, because that's what this is. We're the only consortium, the only access program in the nation that includes all health-related institutions. Who would have thought that Texas A&M, UT, Texas Tech, Baylor, and the list goes on, is going to work together to affect and improve the care? Because when you think about funds, and you guys know this, and grants, we're competitive, and competition's good. But sometimes you also have to put your hands together and let's work together. Because the bigger picture was the children and youth and the families of the state of Texas. And that's what we've done, and it's impressive what we're doing with the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium. The Hogg Foundation is part of that. Mental Health Policy Institute is part of that. Texas Council of Community Centers. So it was also the recognition that we also needed more voices at the table to address this complex and huge issue. And it was mentioned by the justices about using technology. This uses technology in a way that we are actually now able to, and will continue, because we're just at the beginning of ramping this up. How this will look in 10 years from now is going to be so amazing when you compare it to where we are today. And yet, the beginning looks really sharp and really good. So I've been talking about brick and mortar, the hospital system, technology with the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium. What about where the majority of care happens for the majority of mental health and substance use needs? We know it happens in primary care. Psychiatrists like myself and others that are here in the room, we're the specialists. We get a little piece of that. But the majority is happening in the primary care setting. There is a better model out there. We've been implementing that and expanding it in the state of Texas, which is the collaborative care model, the integrated care model, where truly we bring together and recognize the mind and body are not separate. Historically, these silos we created between the mind and the body were illogical, if you think about it. It was more driven by policy and by funding streams than it was how we should be treating a human being, an individual. And research has now shown, and now we recognize how important it really is. Where some mental health illnesses, say like major depression, in fact increases your risk for diabetes, and vice versa. Individuals with diabetes are at increased risk for anxiety and depression. Same thing with cardiac events. If you have a heart attack, cardiology today now recognizes and understands they need to be wary of you may be having a depressive episode. Some of it is iatrogenically created, which means it's done by us, the doctors, maybe through our medications. Others are because it puts you at risk because of the stress and the trauma of going through a heart attack or going through a chronic illness like diabetes. Diabetes, as we know, in the state of Texas and nationally, #1 cause of amputations. Imagine what happens when your diabetes has been taken care of, and now you've had to lose a toe, a foot, an ankle, or an entire leg. And this is happening in the state of Texas. We need to stop that. And so that's where really working closely and recognizing in the primary care setting, we need to be addressing all of these issues as we're considering how to create the best health outcome for all of us. So let's turn over to a little bit to health coverage. Another major component of that overall framework that I mentioned. And as you can see here, we still need to work at and ensure, if we're recognizing the mind and body work together and should no longer be separated, we also need to go back to some of the funding, to some of the drivers that have separated us historically. And that means we need to start recognizing and paying for that parity needs to be part of the process. We need to continue to advance that, to ensure that those of us who do have healthcare insurance, however it is for in the private or public sector, that we are covering everything that can, in fact, be a malady of an individual. And so we'll continue to need to make some work on that. But we are making progress. Recognizing that healthcare is also an industry. Health deliverables are products. It can get really expensive, as we all well know, some of those of us that have been dealing with medical issues, right? And so recognizing and understanding how those drivers work, where we continue to move toward value-driven healthcare. We're doing that, but we need to continue to accelerate and do research in that respect. Because as a capitalist society, what hasn't worked for us is fee-for-service. Fee-for-service actually drives and empowers the illness model that currently exists in our healthcare system. We don't get paid for keeping you healthy. It's unfortunate, but it's true. We get paid if you get sick. We get paid if you need surgery. Now, some surgeries we can't avoid, but some of them, they're avoidable if we go really upstream and really address what we need to be doing for prevention. If we get to that, then we start changing that whole paradigm. And that's where we're in the midst of currently. And so really looking more at episodes of care and also bundled payment approaches versus those two extremes that are on the screen right now. Let me turn a little bit to engagement. So as you can see, I'm hitting just some major big topics that over the course of this conference, hopefully you will keep in mind, and in the session that you're in, you'll bring these to bear and to think about, because it's all connected. But the mental health care and substance use disorder system, I've underlined it again because I feel that's where we are finally moving toward actually having a system of care in that respect. Why? Because we need to provide services where they're needed, where you need it, not where the doctors need them. We need, or our psychologists or other parts of the healthcare team. We need to bring them more to you. Ensure institutions reflect the populations they serve. We're a great diverse state. We're getting more and more data after the census as it's coming out and recognizing how the state of Texas is changing from El Paso to Beaumont, from Brownsville to Amarillo. This great state of ours is changing in leaps and bounds, in some counties more than others. But we need to respect, getting back to community engagement, what's happening in each of those geographic settings and in our metro areas and in our rural settings. And then it follows that we should have cultural and linguistic diversity and understand how to address those issues. And continue to move toward efficacy. Again, equity, quality of care. Because we're doing it. So getting back to the investment in the infrastructure system for the state hospital system, and I'm just going to use the Austin State Hospital redesign as one of them, being led by the Dell Medical School. I'm on the executive committee on that as well, and recognizing, taking a look at and infusing and working with HHSC, our Health and Human Services Commission, that it's really about a continuum of care now. What needs to be happening outside of the four walls of this institution to ensure that we're never going to get rid of state hospitals, folks, but we can minimize their use by being totally efficient, efficacious, and providing as much care as we can outside of those four walls. What can we do in our communities? Keep our folks where they've grown up, where they recognize, where they learn, where they trust, and where they live. We can do that to a greater extent than we do now, and we're moving in that direction. I think that's what's so exciting as we're looking at these redesigns. And it's happening at ASH. It's happening at San Antonio State Hospital. We're looking at Rusk. The ARP funds, hopefully it'll fall through. I mean, come through, not fall through, come through. Faux pas, right? Freudian slip. Well, anyway, the hospital up in Dallas, they haven't had a state hospital. They need that resource. The new Houston one that's been built, the upgrades that have been happening at Kerrville, you know, it's across the whole state. It's really exciting. Again, generational, the investments that we are making. What we recognize, and I really appreciate, is that no longer are we just seeing mental health and substance use and the needs of our communities as just a cost, but in fact, it's an investment in us, an investment for the future. That makes a huge difference, just that paradigm shift alone. And it was already been mentioned by the judges about SIMS, the sequential intercept model. So the role that the Judicial Commission of Mental Health is playing, imagine the changes that are happening, the innovations that are occurring across this great state, or the recognition of we need to make this better. That is part of the dialogue now today. Was it part of the dialogue 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago? Maybe it was, but it was on a much smaller scale. But now the scale is increasing, and now you have lots of great folks like yourselves and those that are online wanting to make a difference. And where is that going to take us? To outcomes. Let's change the outcomes from historically where we've been to being an exemplar for all the other states to envy. We could do it. We're the state of Texas, right? You're with me? I think you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's make the vision become reality. And it starts like with what's happening here at this conference, at this symposium. Thinking strategically, thinking critically, and then putting those thoughts into action. Thoughts are great, but if we don't turn into actions. And so let's make the vision a reality. Seamless, integrated health, mental health, and substance use care delivered in a culturally and linguistically person-centered framework at the individual, family, and community practice system and workforce level. I'll say it again, though. This is hard work. This is not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. This takes time, energy, and investment. Because what I really would like to see is that no longer do we stigmatize and misunderstand people with IDD, intellectual development disorder, individuals that have a substance use disorder and are relegated to the margins of society, or someone dealing with a depression or a post-traumatic stress disorder who's come home from fighting on behalf of our country to become homeless, to not feel the love that the country should be giving them, right? I get a little emotional because I got a brother that went through this. But we will do that. But one of the things we got to do is we got to create the right workforce, a workforce for the 21st century, and we got to be thinking out of the box. We're not going to be able to create enough child and adolescent psychiatrists overnight. We're not going to be able to create enough geriatric psychologists overnight. But what we can do is band together and recreate what is the team. For example, and we've been doing it here in the great state of Texas, surprisingly to a lot of other states out there, of how we have elevated recovery and certified peer specialists as an example, and making them part of the team. And it's happening in all the new medical schools. Take a look. I mean, we've been investing like crazy. Oops, I shouldn't use the C word, sorry. We've been investing amazingly to ensure that we do have a workforce for the 21st century. But we got to start as early as we can. We've got to build a multidisciplinary, diverse workforce. And that can't be too early when we're looking at it. We need to be thinking all the way to pre-K, folks. We really need to be enhancing and looking at our educational system across the educational continuum to ensure that it's providing and creating the workforce for the 21st century. Not just for healthcare, but also for the judicial system, for the private sector. Who's going to be the CEOs of tomorrow? Who are going to be the innovators, the entrepreneurs? We need that desperately. And we're putting great thought to that as well. But no, we can't be too early, is my point. And getting back to health equity, it really is important because it's about quality. To attain the highest level of health possible for all of us. That, I think, is a worthy goal. But a bigger one is ensuring we're also creating well-being overall. And here I'll share with you with the Hogg Foundation what we work on, how we take a look at things, which is when we say well-being, we're invoking an ongoing condition, a state of being that requires more than physical health to produce the feelings of satisfaction and fulfillment. Tell me, who of you doesn't deserve that? I say we all do. But there are challenges and there are barriers to sometimes achieving that. And we need to recognize that. And where it's on an individual basis, it's on you, it's on me. But sometimes it's at the community level, or at the state level, or at the federal level. And we must recognize that as well. And we shouldn't leave out research. We need to continue to study and evaluate and develop evidence-based approaches to everything I've been talking about. So here's a model to ensure that we're taking our research, translating it, and putting it into practice. Historically, one thing that we have done, and that's on us, the research community, we've taken too long to translate our research and turn it into actionable, implementable items. I think the pandemic has shown that we can actually do things rather quickly without compromising the underlying research and the efficacy. However, we've all been witnessing in real time how it plays out. And it can be exasperating, and it can be worrisome. But all those questions, all those approaches, all of those criticisms, we should accept them, learn from them, and move forward. Because we want to be able to ensure we are continuing to do the research in the social determinants of mental health. And how does that impact the judicial system? What's the interface and what is it happening when it comes to also, why is transportation so important in rural settings? How does it impact our health? And we're getting better and better at understanding that correlation or that association, whatever the case may be. It then helps us to identify, this is where we really need to start putting some of our resources and investments. How do we help community come up with their own ideas? Many of them do. So how do we stand them up? Instead of a top-down, maybe it has to be a bottom-up approach, because I think both approaches are equally important and valuable. So ensuring a just and equitable outcome. So I'm going to land on one place that I think is important, and it starts with us, really, as we're going through and understanding. A lot of what I'm talking about is contextual, and in a minute you'll see why that's important for context. And we've heard about implicit bias, but the truth is, do we all really know what implicit bias really means and how it impacts us as individuals, as human beings? Remember that what happens, it's subconscious. It's at a level that we're not completely aware of. That's what subconscious it means, right? But it impacts and affects us in our beliefs and our behaviors. And so it shows a bias, means that you have a favoritism or you see certain things a certain way. We all do it. There is not one human being on the planet that doesn't have bias. It is a construct that comes from our development. Biases, stereotypes, categorization is how the human brain deals with all the information that's coming at us, right? And depending on how that information comes in, determines on how you interpret it. And so it resides within implicit bias itself. There's bias and an implicit bias, which is the one that we've now categorized as part of structural racism. Because it's about the context of how you see other individuals who are different from you. And so bias is present, as I'm saying, in many contexts. We've seen it play out. We've seen some of the outcomes, even if we didn't want the outcomes to be what they are. In education, unfortunately, where Black students are more harshly disciplined, the studies have shown. And even in pre-K. Why does that happen? Healthcare. We're not immune. It happens to all the professions. Like I said, it's across the board. There was a great study that was done with cardiologists, talking about, my colleagues in healthcare, right? So what they did was there was a vignette, had all the clinical symptoms, and based on those clinical symptoms, what the cardiologist should do is actually refer for cardiac catheterization. And when just given the vignette, the cardiologists all got it right. But then what they did with the study was they then laid on demographics and a photograph of the individual with those symptoms. They didn't change the vignette. They just added demographics. I think you guys know what happened. The outcomes changed. Not everybody was referred for cardiac catheterization. And guess who got the least referral? By the way, I didn't mention, so they did a black female, black male, white female, white male, when they put the demographics on. It was the black female. She received now the least referrals for cardiac catheterization. Goes to show, well-educated, well-intentioned individuals have dedicated their life to improve health, regardless of who you are still subject to implicit bias. When they were given the results, they were like, that can't be me. That's just, no, I don't do that. But it's subconscious. That's the power and why we need to understand implicit bias. In the workplace, we've seen the studies that have come out of how if a resume seems to be overly ethnicized, it doesn't get the same kind of attention to one that is more generic. And of course, in the criminal justice system, we unfortunately, studies have shown that when they're shown a black face, it kind of elicits more a response of the individual being more dangerous than the average person. And so, we are all subject to this. Subconscious expectations. Based on what, though? Remember, I'm talking about contextualization. That's what I really want you to take away from this talk today. Our beliefs and experiences. But how do we get our beliefs and experiences, right? Because it's a natural part of human survival, as I mentioned. Categorizing, coming up with biases, coming up with stereotypes. Now, when it turns into behavior, that's what's called discrimination. But that's down the road. But initially, how are we impacted? Well, it's because it's learned. And it happens from the day you're born. The context in which you are born into is what starts to impart implicit bias and biases in general into that growing human being. That's where it starts. And like I said, none of us are immune. And some of these are worthy of in recognizing what kind of impact is this happening, though, to us as a community. And so the challenge comes with expectations or decisions that are based on what are called in developmental, research priors or false priors. And so that implicit bias exists without prejudice or racist intent. Now take that away, because this is really important, because many folks, and I've heard them, and they're being honest, are saying, I'm not a racist. And I believe in them. They are correct. They're not. But the implicit biases in the context at a subconscious level that have influenced you makes you, unfortunately, unless you take the time to really drill down and to reflect on how it affects your behavior or the outcomes that you're involved in. So what does it do? It reveals more about our context than it does of us as individuals. Now, the reason I keep saying context is because, as you'll see, we can change the context. See, that's the important thing here. And it makes a huge difference in how the future and ensuring that all these investments that we're making don't still have that disproportionality gap that historically has existed, even though there have been wonderful programs historically, right? And so, to mitigate implicit bias, we need to focus on changing the systems, the structures, and the situations. And we're starting to do that. The Judicial Commission on Mental Health, by in effect existing today, is starting to change the system. Creating the infrastructure that I mentioned about the state hospitals and looking more at continuum of care and not just brick and mortar and warehousing human beings that are different from us is changing the system and the actual structure and the situations. That's the positive thing. But we've got to remain very vigilant about implicit bias because of its subconscious impact on folks. Now, I don't want to, end up having everybody go into psychotherapy, but, as a psychiatrist, that'd be great for me to bring all you guys in and make a bundle. But, it's more about really self-reflecting. But there are ways that we are impacted by implicit bias. The situation that one is in, how does it that implicit bias really rears up and becomes part of my judgment or decision making? Well, as you can see here, it's by these prompts. Sometimes others call them triggers of what triggers implicit bias. The last two are the ones that I think are really quite important, especially when I think about the healthcare system, providers, and even when I think about judges and attorneys and the work that we do, where we have to make quick decisions, where we have to be able to, respond in real time. But it's then when we're fatigued, when we're overworked, we're under time pressure, that subconscious takes over. It's the automatic response instead of just pausing for a bit and thinking about, am I being as objective as I know I want to be? Because I know in this room, it is a huge value that we all cherish, and it's about objectivity and justice. And therefore, thinking about what could actually be undermining that is what I'm really referring to and for us to think about. Because if we don't, and this is also human behavior, we will rationalize our subconscious decisions. Consciously rationalizing, not realizing subconsciously of what actually happened and how the impact and outcome has resulted in what it has. And so we focus more on the individual and say, oh, well, it's their problem. Instead of maybe stepping back and realizing what was the environment that created this decision-making process that I participated in. Knowing historical context is really important because it helps us to understand where people are today and what we need to do to ensure that they're going to have a healthy outcome going forward. The myth of the zero-sum game. Really, we all can do a win-win. It doesn't have to be zero-sum, but it does help rationalize that the reason that you lost is because I have to win. And of course, an easier one is definitely not me, but it's really a small group of individuals who really do believe in supremacy of one group over another, and they're the problem. I'm not saying that that's not a problem, but when it comes to implicit bias, and remember I'm saying we are all prone to it regardless of who you are, the color of your skin, we have biases. And so we can address it. It can be done. And like I said, we're already making structural changes, changing the context. And we need to highlight that and emphasize how important that really is and the positive impact it's going to make on behalf of all of us. And so the fact that we're discussing this, that you're going to have this conference, is part of the process. You can do the implicit association test. It's online. There's the link. It's a good place to start to do that. But I want you to remember that it's not, if you take because I've done it a couple of times, and I don't like the results, to be honest, but it's not about the individual's personal failing. Keep that in mind. What it does do, though, it helps to identify, as I put here, the disparate impacts that have happened contextually to us that then results in the outcome that we're seeing. But we have something that is really important. It's called the brain. And part of the brain, this is a wonderful part of it called the executive functioning part of the brain. And in that executive function, we can learn, we can understand, we can change not only ourselves, but things around us. The other thing that I love about, say, the Judicial Commission on Mental Health, as you can see there in the second bullet, to address these issues, we have to get closer to these issues. And so that's what the Supreme Court of Texas and Criminal Justice Court of Appeals, in my opinion, did. They recognized trends and patterns, didn't like the outcomes, and they said, we got to pay more attention to this issue. And they actually created a commission. Think about that, how that changes the dialogue and the dynamic. To learn more about the folks that are being impacted in our criminal justice, that interface between mental health substance use and IDD and the criminal justice system and our court systems. And then the SIMS model of how to actually then address that. But keeping in mind that we need to keep in mind that disproportionately, people of color are being impacted worse than others. Why is that the case? How are we contributing to that, not unknowingly, subconsciously? This is where we can actually ensure and in fact, enhance the effectiveness of the structure that we're creating. And we can minimize those triggers or prompts as well. By identifying these biases and identifying where they're most challenging and most impactful is always a good place to begin. And that's what JCMH is doing. And that's what I'm so happy to be part of. And so let me end with this, an intentionality exercise. Now, this is just for you individually. Do not share this little exercise that I'm going to ask you to do with me. I just want you to think about it. I'm stealing it from Kimberly Manning. She's a professor of medicine, associate vice chair of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Emory Department of Medicine. So let's all just pull out your cell phones and then go to the little one that looks like phones don't even look like that anymore, do they? But it's that little icon for phone. And then just take a look at who are your favorites, who are you calling, and who are you calling the most? Who do you interact with the most? And this is just for you to think about. Exclude work colleagues. Really get into your social network and who really is on that list. Who are you talking to daily? Or maybe not daily, but when you really have a problem or you really want to reach out, who do you trust? Who are you calling? Think about that. Dr. Manning is a black physician in Emory, right? She did this exercise for herself. And she realized when she excluded coworkers, everybody on the list that she talked to was black. She was not talking to anyone else that was different than what she was, trustworthy with, who was in her inner circle. And so she has started, which I think is just, really talking about how do you change implicit bias? How do you change the context? Who am I actually interacting with? Because one of the important things that we do know this, that neurodevelopments have shown us and the studies show, when we interact more with others that are different from us, we start to understand, we start to respect, we start to become friends. We start to create relationships. We start to trust, we understand, and we have someone we can go to and say, help me understand this situation. Because we all have, and I'll end with this, biases. So enjoy the conference. This is going to be wonderful. But with this last quote, until justice is blind to color, till education is unaware of race, till opportunity is unconcerned with the color of men's skins, should be probably person's skins, right? Emancipation will be a proclamation, but not a fact. Thank you very much. It's been a real honor to chat with you today.